The detrimental impact of alcohol on family relationships often leads to the destruction of families and the shattering of human destinies. Under the influence of alcohol, people lose self-control and can pose a serious threat to those around them. The main character of this story, Lauren Malt, learned firsthand how dangerous a person can be when. Lauren was born on April 8, 2002, in Great Britain. The girl grew up surrounded by 3 younger brothers who provided her with reliable protection and support. The children in the Malt family were very close-knit and always ready to help one another. Lauren, as the oldest sister, often comforted her restless little brothers. However, despite the warm relationship between the children, the atmosphere in the Malt household was far from ideal. Lauren's father, unlike her kind and gentle mother, was a very cruel man. Karen, the girl's mother, grew up in a rural area in a middle-income family. While studying at college, she met Nigel Malt, an athletic and ambitious young man who dreamed of a successful career. The relationship between Karen and Nigel developed very quickly, and it seemed like they were the perfect couple to start a strong family. However, not everyone shared Karen's admiration for her chosen one. The girl's mother considered Nigel too rough and advised her daughter to end the relationship, but the love-struck Karen did not heed the advice. At first, the married life of the young couple was quite normal, and they seemed to be a happy and loving pair. They had children, but gradually Nigel's character began to change. He started manipulating his wife, morally oppressing her, and keeping her by his side through lies and emotional blackmail. By the time Lauren was born, the relationship between Karen and Nigel had already significantly deteriorated, but the woman continued to tolerate her husband. She was financially dependent on him, as frequent pregnancies prevented her from getting an education and finding a decent job. Karen hoped that she would be able to return to her studies after her maternity leave, but she soon became pregnant again. Nigel had a long history of alcohol and he started using illicit substances in his youth, and by the time of the events described, he could no longer do without them. It all began quite innocently with smoking cigarettes, but later grew into regular use of hard. Nigel's addiction had very serious and unpleasant consequences. Before his addiction reached a critical point, Nigel was a fairly adequate person. But then his behavior changed dramatically. He became very aggressive, often lost his temper, and treated his wife cruelly. Karen endured her husband's abuse for a long time, hoping that the birth of a child would make him come to his senses. She remembered Nigel as a completely different person, a pleasant, decent guy she once fell in love with. But over time, the situation became increasingly dangerous. In his fits of rage, Nigel began to get physical and beat his wife. The once calm and good-natured man now lashed out at Karen for any reason. And she had dreamed so much of a happy family, imagining her life to be like the American dream, a loving husband, a bunch of kids, a cozy home, and the opportunity to pursue her favorite activities. But all of Karen's dreams were shattered. Nigel had also once dreamed of a good career, and he and his wife complemented each other perfectly. But as soon as things started looking up, the man began abusing alcohol and it turned him into a real monster who had no control over himself. Nigel not only humiliated and beat his wife, but over time, his aggression spread to Lauren as well. Despite the horror of the situation, Karen tried her best to keep the family together, as the couple already had 4 children together. Divorce would have meant a difficult trial, division of property, and a fight for custody of the children. And although Karen and Nigel did not have much joint property, the woman was terrified of the prospect of being left alone with 4 children. Karen was most worried about the issue of alimony and the right to see the children. She did not know what her husband was capable of and was very afraid that he would use the children to take revenge on her. But there was no more strength to endure. Nigel was no longer just intimidating his family, he began to pose a real threat. If earlier the man at least earned money and provided for the family, now he had completely hit rock bottom, spending almost all the money on alcohol and Karen was most worried about the fate of the children. Lauren and her brothers grew up in constant fear, seeing their father get drunk and beat their mother every day. Although friends and relatives had long advised Karen to divorce her tyrant husband, she still endured humiliation and abuse for a long time, trying to preserve a full-fledged family for the sake of the children. Realizing that the domestic could no longer be corrected, Karen finally dared to have a serious talk with Nigel about divorce. In March 2021, she went to the police for the first time with a complaint about domestic violence. The reason was another drunken quarrel that ended in a brutal beating. However, despite the obvious traces of beatings, the police initially did not show much interest in this case. But a month later, in April, Nigel again brutally beat his wife, even more savagely than the last time. It was then that Karen realized the full horror of the situation and the real threat to herself and the children. She understood that it was necessary to act decisively and immediately put an end to this suffering. Karen called the police again and filed a report on domestic violence. Until recently, threats of law enforcement intervention had somehow restrained Nigel's aggressive behavior, but his impunity only worsened the situation and multiplied the suffering of the family. Last time, in March, Karen had succumbed to her husband's persuasion at the last moment and withdrew the statement so as not to create additional problems for him. Nigel even promised to make concessions and agree to an amicable divorce, but it later turned out that this was just a trick to buy time. After the April beating incident, Karen firmly decided not to believe any more promises and excuses from Nigel. Perhaps she would have endured the abuse further, because, as she herself admitted, she still loved this man and hoped until the last moment that their relationship could still be saved. But now Karen understood that she could no longer delay. Previously, Nigel was restrained not only by threats to call the police but also by the fear that Karen would leave him. But this deterrent effect did not last long. So, in March 2021, during an argument, Nigel threatened to kill his wife for the first time. This greatly frightened Karen, so in April, when Nigel was taken to the police station after her appeal, she took the opportunity and fled with the children from home to her mother. Meanwhile, Nigel was released on bail and placed under house arrest until the end of the trial. He again began to put pressure on Pity, saying that he would commit suicide, but Karen no longer believed a single word of his and was determined. To make her husband understand the seriousness of her intentions, she tried to get a restraining order, but unfortunately, she was unsuccessful. The situation in the family was greatly aggravated by COVID and the lockdown. During this period, serious financial difficulties arose, against the background of which Nigel began to drink even more, becoming more aggressive and cruel. His anger was now directed not only at his wife but also at Lauren and his sons, whom he treated more and more rudely. After the trial, Nigel was found guilty of domestic violence and sentenced to a suspended sentence, being prohibited from approaching his wife and children. In fact, he lost everything. His beloved wife left him, no longer wanting to listen to any promises and excuses, and the children refused to communicate with their father because of his unpredictable and cruel behavior. Nigel drank and used every day, completely losing control of his pernicious habit. He cherished vain hopes for the restoration of the relationship, but Karen was adamant and insisted on divorce. This situation finally threw the man off track. Despite his promises to quit, he seemed to be degrading even more and justifying his behavior by the desire to escape from problems. Now Karen had to take care of 4 children on her own, so the issue of alimony became acute. The woman got a job as a saleswoman in a store, but the salary was not enough, so her daughter Lauren worked part-time to somehow help her mother. However, the lawyer assured Karen that she should not worry about custody of the children. Given Nigel's alcoholism and accusations of domestic violence, the court could completely deprive him of parental rights. Lauren, who was 19 at the time, had a strained relationship with her father throughout her childhood, so she preferred to communicate with her mother. However, she still occasionally met with Nigel in order not to completely lose touch with him. Like Karen, the girl still believed that there was hope for her father's salvation. During this period, Lauren lived with her mother and brothers in her grandmother's house in the small village of West Winch, Norfolk. The girl was dating a guy named Arthur and worked a lot to help her family and save up for education. On that fateful day, Sunday, January 23, 2022, Arthur drove Lauren to work at the store where she worked as a saleswoman. During the day, Nigel called his daughter several times, but she did not want to be distracted from work by conversations with her father, who was most likely in an inadequate state. Lauren understood perfectly well that communicating with him would only spoil her mood. That day, the girl stayed at work late and was very tired. Upon returning home, she only dreamed of resting with her boyfriend, because the next morning she had to go to work again. Suddenly, late in the evening, calls from Nigel began again. Lauren had no doubt that her father had already managed to get drunk, because it seemed that he could not be caught sober even on Sunday. Lauren decided to ignore her father's persistent calls, hoping that he would eventually calm down. However, Nigel was remarkably persistent and called his daughter as many as 19 times from 6:25 p.m. to 6:52 p.m. The phone was literally ringing off the hook with incessant calls, but the girl stubbornly refused to answer. Something similar had happened before. Usually, during such conversations, her father only insulted Lauren, her mother, and brothers. These calls did not carry any useful information, but only greatly annoyed the girl and knocked her off track. Unfortunately, it was impossible to completely ignore Nigel, because he lived only a 10-minute drive from their house and could easily visit them. The worst thing was that this had already happened. Her father came uninvited and under far-fetched pretexts, arranging drunken scandals. Nothing prevented him from repeating such a visit this time as well. Around 7:14 p.m., when Nigel called again, Lauren finally answered, fearing that otherwise the situation would only get worse. Her father talked to his daughter for a few minutes. As the girl expected, the conversation had no meaningful content. Nigel immediately began to insult and intimidate Lauren. The girl tried to calm her alcoholic father down, but it seemed that this only infuriated him even more. According to Lauren's boyfriend Arthur, at 7:21 p.m., a drunk and aggressively minded Nigel drove up to their house. Karen, the girl's mother, was not at home at that time. She was at work. Lauren went outside to try to pacify her enraged father, but he only loudly insulted her and tried to start a fight. The man held a crowbar in his hands and almost hit his daughter with it several times. Nigel's behavior was extremely dangerous, but he could not even explain what exactly caused such an outburst of aggression in him. After several unsuccessful attempts to grab Lauren, her father suddenly shouted that he was going to beat her boyfriend. All this time, Arthur was next to the girl and tried to persuade Nigel to calm down. Lauren barely managed to influence her father, after which she told him to go away, because she was not going to talk to him in this state. The girl tried to put Nigel in the car so that he would finally leave. But suddenly, her father started shouting again, got into the car, and just at the moment when Lauren was standing behind the car, he abruptly backed up. The enraged man ran over his own daughter. He stopped for a few seconds and through the windshield saw that the girl was seriously injured. She was bleeding and begging for help. But Nigel did not even think to get out of the car to check on Lauren's condition or call an ambulance. Instead, he stepped on the gas and ran over his daughter a second time. It all happened so quickly that Arthur did not even have time to react and help his girlfriend. The incident attracted the attention of neighbors who called the police. One of the men ran out into the street and tried to stop the frenzied Nigel. He saw that Lauren was lying on the ground, moaning in pain and, judging by everything, had serious injuries, but was still alive. The witness understood that it was urgently necessary to call an ambulance, because the girl had probably received injuries that made it impossible to even lift her off the asphalt. But Nigel did not care. He kept repeating, as if stuck, that everything was fine with Lauren and she only had a few scratches. The father drove away both the neighbor and Arthur, who were shouting at him to stop and call for help. The men were completely shocked by what they saw. The drunken Nigel did not even think of calling an ambulance. Instead, he lifted his wounded daughter from the ground, ignoring her moans of pain, and roughly shoved the girl into the passenger seat. From the injury she received, Lauren had probably suffered fractures and could not even sit normally. She could not keep her balance. Nigel did not even bother to fasten his daughter's seatbelt, so the girl almost immediately slid to the floor in front of the passenger seat, twisting into an unnatural position. The absolutely insane man drove off in an unknown direction. During the trip, he called his ex-wife Karen and began to confusedly tell about some incident. Allegedly he accidentally injured Lauren and would bring her soon. From Nigel's drunken explanations, the woman understood little, but decided to wait until her ex-husband arrived at her work. According to the father, nothing serious had happened to his daughter. He just wanted to hand Lauren over to her mother so that Karen could take the girl to the hospital. Nigel explained that he could not do it himself because he had been drinking and was afraid of losing his license. Eventually, the man arrived at the parking lot near the store where Karen worked. As soon as the woman saw the terrible condition her daughter was in, she immediately realized that her ex-husband had greatly understated the seriousness of the situation. Lauren was barely alive. Karen tried to carefully lift the girl from the floor of the car and put her on the seat to assess the extent of her injuries. Throughout this time, Nigel just stood aside and silently watched what was happening. Lauren did not react in any way to her mother's attempts to help her. It seemed that the girl was about to lose consciousness from the excruciating pain. Realizing that every second counted, Karen immediately called an ambulance. The medics arrived at the scene and urgently took the victim to the hospital. Seeing the girl's condition, the doctors immediately realized that the injuries were extremely serious, and Lauren's life could only be saved in a well-equipped medical center. The medical staff made every effort to stabilize the patient's condition and give her a chance for salvation. However, unfortunately, the girl's heart stopped just a few minutes after she was brought to the operating room. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the scene of the incident, at the house where Lauren lived. They were met by the deceased's frightened boyfriend and a neighbor who witnessed the terrible event. The law enforcement officers immediately noticed bloody tire tracks on the driveway, silent witnesses to how the girl's own father had callously run over his daughter. Unlike many other crimes, in this case, there was enough evidence to immediately bring charges against the suspect. The forensic expert had to carefully document all the injuries the girl received as a result of the double hit and run. The autopsy showed that as a result of the incident, Lauren Malt suffered a spinal fracture, due to which she could not maintain her balance and slid to the floor of the car. The girl's chest was completely crushed, and her ribs were broken. Bone fragments pierced the lungs, causing massive internal bleeding. Injuries to the chest and abdomen proved fatal, leading to damage and destruction of many internal organs. The nature of the injuries clearly indicated that the girl had been run over by a car twice. Experts concluded that after the first hit and run, Lauren had every chance of surviving. But even after the second incident, she still had hope for salvation if she had been provided with professional medical assistance on the spot without trying to transport her on their own. The fatal mistake was the attempt to put the seriously injured girl in the car. This only worsened her condition. Precious time was lost, and this delay, unfortunately, cost Lauren her life. The suspect, 45-year-old Nigel, was immediately detained. The initial examination showed that the man was in a state of severe alcohol. The level of alcohol in his blood was more than twice the permissible norm for drivers of vehicles. Karen was sure that it was because of alcohol or drugs that her ex-husband behaved so inadequately and cruelly. Of course, the state of inebriation in no way justified what had been done, but only aggravated Nigel's guilt. Once in custody, the man refused to cooperate with the investigation. He provided only basic personal data, name and address of residence, but refused to give any comments about the incident. During the preliminary hearing of the case, Nigel still did not admit his guilt, despite the irrefutable evidence provided by witnesses. The man insisted that his daughter's death was just an accident. According to the version of the deceased's father, that evening he came to Lauren because she first did not answer his calls, and then began to talk rudely with him on the phone. Nigel allegedly wanted to pacify his daughter, but nothing came of it, so he decided to leave and postpone the conversation for later. The man claimed that when he got into the car and backed up, he felt the car run over something. He thought he had run over a box, a stone, or some other object that he had not noticed in the rearview mirror. Nigel insisted that he did not even suspect that he had hit his own daughter. Allegedly, in order to get off the obstacle, he had to return to the starting position, and then he, supposedly to his great surprise, ran over Lauren again. Of course, all these testimonies were nothing more than the cowardly lies of a criminal who, even after what he had done, did not dare to admit his guilt. The investigators drew attention to the indifference and cold-bloodedness with which Nigel spoke about his daughter's death. It seemed that this blatant display of cruelty did not bother him at all. On the contrary, when talking about his family, the man always spoke about Karen and Lauren with disdain and contempt. For everyone, such behavior of Nigel was completely incomprehensible. After all, Karen was a decent woman and a caring mother who devoted herself to her family. Lauren inherited her mother's best traits and, despite the extremely unfavorable family atmosphere caused by her tyrant father, grew up to be an honest and responsible girl. She never abused alcohol or drugs. Instead, she dreamed of getting a good education, building a career, and achieving a better life. Lauren's neighbor and boyfriend strongly refuted Nigel's claims about the unintentional nature of the hit and run. According to them, after running over his daughter while reversing, the man looked at her for a few more seconds. The car's headlights clearly illuminated the girl, so her father simply could not help but notice her. And then he turned on the transmission and deliberately ran over Lauren a second time. The witnesses insisted that everything that happened could not be attributed to an accident. Even if we assume that the first time Nigel really did not notice his daughter, then during the second hit and run, she was definitely in his field of vision. The neighbor claimed that that evening a serious conflict occurred between Lauren and Nigel. The man behaved extremely aggressively, threatening his daughter and her boyfriend with a crowbar. Even when running over Lauren, Nigel had a malicious grin on his face. He clearly was not going to stop. The incident witness, a neighbor named Gert, suggested that the reason for Nigel's sudden outburst of cruelty was that Lauren dared to ask her father to leave. However, the investigation had not only the testimony of eyewitnesses at its disposal. While Gert was trying to verbally pacify the enraged man, several local residents, peering out of the windows of their houses, filmed everything that was happening on their mobile phone cameras. These video materials were later presented to the court as irrefutable evidence of Nigel's guilt. The recordings clearly show how the father deliberately directs the car at his own daughter. Moreover, the prosecution insisted that not only the second but also the first hit and run was an intentional act and not an accident. Even the defendant's lawyer agreed that it was extremely difficult to explain the incident as an accidental coincidence of circumstances. However, the defender still tried to prove that the murder was not intentional. But these arguments sounded very unconvincing in the context of the available video evidence and testimony of witnesses. The bloody tire tread marks collected at the crime scene completely matched the tire pattern on Nigel's car, but this procedure was more of a formality. Taking into account the totality of irrefutable evidence, the court found the defendant guilty of committing this terrible crime. In September of the same year, a hearing was held at which Nigel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 18 years. When deciding on the term of punishment, the court took into account Karen's testimony about the systematic domestic violence by her ex-husband. The family of the deceased girl assured that they would make every effort to prevent the premature release of the killer. In an interview with the media, Karen announced her intention to be present at every meeting of the parole board in order to personally defend her position. At the sentencing, 45-year-old Nigel appeared in a very pitiful state. According to reports, his health had significantly deteriorated during his time in pre-trial detention. The man even moved with the help of crutches and had almost completely grayed. However, even in such a state, he still did not admit his guilt, insisting that his daughter's death was a tragic accident. Some believe that the defendant was trying in this way to soften the judges and appear in the role of a victim, as he often did in relations with his wife. Others were convinced that all these misfortunes and illnesses were a just retribution that this cruel murderer fully deserved for his actions. Be that as it may, Nigel is currently serving his sentence in a correctional institution, and his health, according to available information, has more or less stabilized. Lauren Malt was determined to finally sever all ties with her ex-husband. For her, it was humiliating to bear the surname of a person who, in a fit of drunken rage, had coldly taken the life of his own child. The fact that Nigel had run over his daughter twice with a car, actually using it as a weapon, left the girl no chance of survival. In view of this, Karen believed that a life sentence was too lenient a punishment for her ex-husband. The woman was convinced that Nigel should under no circumstances be released. According to Karen, we are talking about an extremely dangerous and cruel criminal who has lost all control over himself due to drunkenness and his stay at large, as the widow claimed, would inevitably lead to new tragedies. It is noteworthy that Nigel's sons have repeatedly stated that they would only be able to feel safe if their father remained behind bars for the rest of his days. The horrific story of the Malt family has shaken the public and once again heightened discussions about how to ensure effective protection for victims of domestic violence. Activists and public figures demanded harsher punishments for abusers like Nigel. In particular, there were calls to increase the length of prison terms and even to apply life imprisonment without the right to parole. Unfortunately, despite all these initiatives, no significant legislative changes have been made so far.